The war in Ukraine has exposed the double standards of the West. Here's how. However, amidst the entire crisis, we can't help but notice an underlying double standard emerging from the way the world is responding. Ukraine isn't the first country to be invaded illegally, yet we have media commentators consistently highlighting that Ukraine is different and worthy of our sympathy.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
Why? Because they are civilized, European, Christian, and have blonde hair and blue eyes?
You know, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European.
And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
These are Christians, they're white.
Why do we consistently need to be reminded that these aren't Arabs, Muslims, Afghans, or Syrians? Do you need to be a Middle Easterner to be qualified as a refugee?
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan.
And don't get me wrong, of course we care about the Ukrainians, but why do we constantly need to be reminded that these people are different and therefore worthy of our sympathy? You see, when it comes to the case of the Ukrainians, they have the right to bear arms and to fight for their country, and the media celebrates them as defiant heroes. Yet when Arabs or Muslims do the same, they are branded as terrorists. Why is it that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is allowed to teach people how to make Molotov cocktails in their fight against the oppressor, but Palestinian kids from the tender age of 10 are criminalized by the media and imprisoned up to 20 years for throwing rocks at their occupiers? The hypocrisy even extends to the response of global institutions. Russian media and art shows are cancelled, Russian banks are being shut down, and Russian assets are being frozen. Heck, FIFA has also sanctioned all Russian teams from participating, while football stadiums are plastering anti-Putin slogans. Why is it okay for football players to speak out against Russia, yet we saw Mesut Ozil shunned for speaking out in support of the Uyghurs, and Celtic fans fined for waving the Palestinian flag? And when we look at the responses of world leaders, we see the exact same hypocrisy. Biden is somewhat shocked by a foreign country invading another.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors?
But will never say the same thing about Israel invading Palestine. Boris Johnson is praising the resistance of the Ukrainians, but God forbid he say the same thing about a Muslim resistance.
They are fighting back, perhaps with more effect, with more resistance than the Kremlin had bargained for.
Obama has passionately spoken out against the actions of Russia and the need to impose sanctions. But where were the sanctions against US bombings against Iraq and Afghanistan?
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Undoubtedly, witnessing the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an emotional affair. However, distinguishing anguish and displacement based on one's hair and eye color raises many questions with regards to the apparent double standards there are in our world when it comes to the effects of war and refugees. As Khaled Baidoun puts it, let's not lose sight of how religion, race, and namely whiteness figures heavily into refugee resettlement. The double standard on forced displacement is glaring. Take for example the countries who have welcomed Ukrainian refugees: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. Poland and Hungary have offered food, shelter, and all necessary aid to Ukrainians fleeing war. Yet in Poland, only 2 months ago, security forces were accused of torturing refugees from Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, in Hungary, these are the images of a fence constructed to stop refugees from entering their borders. That is, non-white ones, of course. Now let's flip the script. Europe's biggest Muslim-majority country, Turkey, has accepted Ukrainian refugees for years, without xenophobia and the hostility facing Muslim refugees when fleeing to Europe. And this phenomenon is not new, not at all.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
An argument that you will hear often on mainstream media is that Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is a civilized place, unlike Afghanistan and Iraq. The irony is, civilization was present in Mesopotamia and Iraq long before it appeared in Eastern Europe. And this is not a tit-for-tat argument, but history speaks for itself. Millions of Jews found refuge in Turkey and Palestine fleeing the Nazi Holocaust. These are images of more European refugees in now war-torn Syria seeking a safe haven from the Nazi and Soviet invasion of Europe. Yet our collective memory perhaps chooses to forget these facts. And it all lies in Edward Said's Orientalism theory. Western narratives illustrate an inappropriate understanding of Asia and the Middle East. Lands of imaginary danger, mystery, and barbarism. Yet it is these dangerous barbarians that were happy to take in Europeans when savagery tore the old continent.
Just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
Are some victims of war more sympathetic than others? If you've been following the coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you may be led to believe that's the case.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan.
These are prosperous, middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East.
European people with blue eyes and blonde hair.
And this is not a developing third world nation.
This is a relatively civilized, relatively European.
This is Europe.
Civilized, blue-eyed, brave, and heroic. This is how some media outlets have described the people of Ukraine, fleeing overwhelming violence or staying behind to fight.
Behind police lines, the rest began to revolt.
Remember, this is a European capital city.
They are largely responsible for an increase of violent crime.
Criminal networks, it's about border control.
People who are grabbing our children.
We want a Europe free from fear, free from terrorists who shout Allah Akbar.
To break the link between leaving Africa and other parts of the world.
Third countries from different civilizations
loses control in its cities.
If this was the middle of the desert somewhere, we wouldn't think twice.
One refugee is presented as sympathetic, another is dangerous and backward. Bulgaria's Prime Minister Kirill Petkov says his country is ready to welcome in Ukrainian refugees, telling journalists, quote, "These are not the refugees we are used to. These people are intelligent. They are educated people." Back in 2016, Bulgaria's leadership praised armed vigilantes that were arresting and pushing back mostly Syrian refugees. Now, Petkov says, quote, "There is not a single European country now which is afraid of the current wave of refugees." The ruling Law and Justice Party in Poland was elected in 2015 on a platform of pushing back Syrian refugees and built a barbed wire fence along the Belarusian border. Now the same government is setting up shelter and food camps ready to welcome in Ukrainian refugees. German and American soldiers can even be seen helping process people coming over the border.